Okay, let her rip.
We rolling tape?
You're rolling anytime.
Okay. Herbie, are you a native of San Francisco?
Born and raised across the bay in Berkeley.
What is it about San Francisco? Why, especially in the 60s, was it such a music conglomeration and a place for music?
I don't know. It's a real good question, and it certainly wasn't restricted to the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, in fact, groups like Santana, for instance, that have been in the top 10 Billboard charts both in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so we have not only a tremendous proliferation of successful artists, the list of artists from the San Francisco Bay Area that have reached #1 nationally in the Billboard charts is an awesome number of artists. It includes Sly and the Family Stone, Janis Joplin, Boz Scaggs, Journey, Huey Lewis now, Santana. I mean, the list is really extremely disproportionate in consideration of the size of the marketplace, why it's a cultural center for rock and roll, and why it's a mecca for rock or contemporary music artists is, I don't understand it myself. It's a wonderful city. It's a great place to live. It's a very desirable climate. And there have been a lot of youth movements that have started here, especially Berkeley being the hot spot that it was, the beginning of the bohemian and the beatnik and the hippie and the yippie eras of socio-political developments. Everything from Cesar Chavez, Mario Savio, Stokely Carmichael, Eldridge Cleaver, the Black Panthers. It all, I don't know, this seems to be where so much of that begins and sometimes ends.
How much influence do you think that the socio-political stuff that you were just talking about had on the music?
Oh, I think a tremendous impact. You know, it's Country Joe and the Fish. What are we fighting for?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, that the whole Vietnam thing was focused here. This is where the famous 7 draft dodgers were at the Oakland induction terminal, and it seems that a lot of the music has focused in on the social developments of the time and of the era, and has been well, I guess all of that activity inspires the songwriters, and so they come here to write about the conflict in society at the time.
What was the, especially let's start at the 60s, because that's sort of where we're starting this whole view of the series. Was there a club scene at that point?
Oh yeah, the Mandrakes, the Matrix, the New Orleans House, the New Monk. There was a great number of clubs like that, and of course then what were really larger, slightly larger than what you would consider a club, but not that much larger, of course, was the Avalon Ballroom, the Arc in Sausalito, the Western Front, and of course the Fillmore Auditorium. And these places seemed to be a lot bigger than they really were. You know, 1,500 people in the Avalon or the Fillmore was wall to wall.
What is there a club scene in San Francisco now?
I think so. I mean, it's a little more business oriented in the sense that the artists that play the clubs now have to do the business, or the clubs are going to go into the toilet zone, and so it's not just show up at the Matrix and watch the Daily Flash or the Great Society and with 3 other people, and yet the club can continue to exist. It's not that way now. We have the Keystone clubs, we have Wolfgang's, we have the Kabuki Theater, which is just a little bit of an overblown club, really, and so there's quite a healthy club scene, I think.
In the earlier days, was there a good deal of camaraderie between the musicians, and does that exist today, do you think?
Yeah, I think it exists today, and it certainly existed back then. In fact, just the other day we were watching a TV show that was shot of a private party that the Dead and the Airplane and Santana threw at the Dog on the Beach, which was a family dog once they had moved out to the beach. And it was really fantastic. I mean, we had, Osley had the 2 garbage cans full of green Kool-Aid that was very electric. And it was KQED TV that still exists here in town, and they didn't realize. And all the cameramen and directors were drinking this Kool-Aid, and it's a pretty psychedelic show. There was many instances. I remember both Sly and the Family Stone and the the Grateful Dead had busts separately in New Orleans back in about '69, I'd say. And so at one time, Santana bought all of Sly's confiscated equipment to give him a little money for their defense. When the Grateful Dead got busted, subsequent to that, almost every act in the Bay Area went to Winterland and played this marathon show and generated all the money to bail them out and defend their position and get them off the hook. It used to be kind of pretty hectic to go out on the road. We always felt very close as a family, and that 100 miles outside of San Francisco, you could be in big trouble. And so, and we generally were. We were trouble on sight. And they would see us, and I tucked my hair in my belt and my beard in my belt, and it was out there was a lot of people who would look at me and just not be able to deal with it. And it's probably the same thing, that way people react now when they see a kid with the mohawk and all the spiked hair and the razor blades and the safety pins and everything else, and I think it's great. I know that if I were 18 years old right now, I'd probably look that way, just out of a sense of rebellion and not wanting to maintain the status quo and go with the ebb and tide of the institutions of the world.
How'd you get started in the business?
Well, when I was really young, I everything was a hobby to me, and everything that I ever did, I was going to do the rest of my life. And when I was 15, I decided it was music, and it turned out to be true. I never looked back. I started out playing saxophone, then drums, and a little guitar. But about when I became 16, I decided to be a manager. I went and asked a group that I thought was very, very good if I could be their manager, and they accepted. And in fact, Ross Valerie, the bass player in Journey, was in that band.
Was this Frumious Bandersnatch?
Frumious. Frumious Bandersnatch. Yes, that was a character in the Song of the Jabberwock by Lewis Carroll. And, the whole Alice in Wonderland thing had a lot to do with our hippie days and that message. And so, that was... most of the members of Frumious Bandersnatch, or all of them, eventually became members of the Steve Miller Band. But I'd left to join Santana before that happened.
And you were Carlos's road manager?
Well, I wasn't his road manager. I started out as his, so to speak, his personal guy but I handled all of the staging and production for the group, and was really one of the first, in a sense, production managers in the business. And they let me come in and gave me carte blanche, and whatever I wanted in terms of a budget. And so they were the first to own their own lighting, their own trucks, their own sound system that we built at no small expense, and handled all those things and toured with them for the first 4 albums.
Herbie, how did Journey come together?
Well, during the making of the 4 Santana record, they were really at odds with each other, and there were drug problems and all the attendant problems of that era. And they didn't really see eye to eye. They didn't work together in the studio, and maybe even before that, that was a Caravanserai album, and perhaps before it was even finished. Greg Raleigh had left. Once it was finished, Neil Schon left, and I continued on with Carlos and was getting. And by that time, I was becoming somewhat the manager, the road manager, the production manager, and everything else combined. And so.
Hold on. Sorry about that.
I mean, if you're running out of tape or whatever your problem is, Mark, let's not do that.
No, fine. I had to get Bob's attention. I'm sorry.
For what? For what?
The microphone. Just have to keep it pointing straight at it.
Oh, okay, yeah, look at him or something. I mean,
Couldn't get his attention.
Now, how do we fix that interruption?
Let's. You were out on the road with Carlos Santana and has become his road manager, his personal manager. Everything else was falling apart.
Yeah, and so I continued past the point that the original band broke up for perhaps another year, but I was disenchanted musically, and I really was a rock and roller more than I was a fusion-oriented, jazz-oriented player. Carlos had, at the point that Santana broke up, he was taking tremendous influence at that time from the Mahavishnu John McLaughlin, so much so that he sought out the help of Sri Srimoy, John's guru, and made him his own guru. And and made a radical change in the musical direction. And so I really missed Greg and Neil. But I primarily missed Neil the most, and went to Neil and said, and at the time, it's a little known fact, Neil was the lead guitar player in Graham Central Station, and playing with Larry Graham and Greg Enrico, the original bass player and drummer from Sly and the Family Stone. And he was great, and the group was fabulous and very popular locally. And Neil was fantastic. He was playing the greatest funk in the world, learning from the masters of funk. Larry Graham invented pluck and thump bass guitar. And but I went to Neil and I said, Neil, it's great, but you can be so important to rock and roll. To be lost in the realm of R&B is inappropriate. Let's put together a rock and roll band. And it just happened to segue with certain problems internally in that original Graham Central Station combo. And so he listened, and I recommended Ross Valerie on bass, and we went through all the personnel, and he said, let's do it. And so we put it together.
Yeah, I had read in interviews that they said that the original band had that sort of Bay Area kind of sound until Steve Perry was brought in. How did it change with Steve being brought in?
Well, yeah, originally, before, like I say, when we first put it together, we called it the Golden Gate Rhythm Section. And what we wanted to do initially was have that ultimate San Francisco stylized sound. And we thought we would have like the Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section. Only it would be the Golden Gate Rhythm Section, and artists would come here and record and want to record with these particular musicians. And of course, Prairie Prince was the original drummer who was with the Tubes. George Tickner, Neil, Greg Raleigh, Ross Valerie. But eventually we decided that the music that we were making was better than and too important to just be given away as sidemen for other people's projects. And so as a result, we created Journey and we started making music, and we dedicated ourselves to making as many contributions to the state of the art as we could. And if we were just basically good, solid players at that point, then we had to acknowledge the fact that there was a lot of room to grow, especially in the area of composing and songwriting, singing and harmonizing, and performing and entertaining. And so those were the things that we focused upon. And each album, prior to Steve Perry, the group became much more song-oriented and vocal-oriented. And you see, initially, the first album was just Greg Raleigh singing. By the second record, there was a lot of harmony activity. By the third record, Neil Schon sang lead on 2 songs, and that was very vocally oriented, where the stage was then perfectly set to bring in a person who had the vocal virtuosity that Neil had on guitar as a guitarist. And we first selected Robert Fleischman, who was very good, and we got great reviews, and we did an Emerson, Lake and Palmer tour with him. But prior to the completion of that tour, and prior to us recording the Infinity album, I heard Steve Perry's voice. I had met him many, many years before, and always had felt that he was a great singer, but I'd never heard him. And I always kept flashing back to him and thinking about him. Even when I went to make my deal with Robert Fleischman, I was crossing the Golden Gate Bridge and I thought about Steve Perry. And then by chance I heard a tape and I couldn't believe it. I then started initiating the changes to make it available for Steve, and the rest is history.
Is it true that the band was named by a radio contest?
No.
No.
That was the press at the time. We did do that type of contest, and it did not yield any viable names. And John Villanueva, who also worked with me from the beginning of the Santana days to the present, he actually named the band Journey. He came up with that, and I said, that's a great name, we're going with it. But we couldn't, since he was an employee, we couldn't publicize the fact that he was the winner, because it was inside. And so we said the winner was Toby Pratt, a famous, just a name we pulled out of a hat. And then after a certain period of time, we came clean and said, hey, the way this really happened.
And having watched your organization here and knowing, maybe from an insider point of view, exactly what you do, and listening to you talk about the development of it, it seems to me, and I'd like for you to elaborate on this if this is true, that maybe sort of your growing up in San Francisco and that musicians community of family has helped you create the Journey family and organization. Do you think that's a pretty valid statement?
Yeah, I think so. There's a certain loyalty, there's a certain camaraderie that is part of it all. There's a lot of people here that have been here for now going on 12 years in the company. And so it's not because we're just blind loyalists and it's cronyism. It's because they are competent and they're talented. But there is certainly an element of love and loyalty that permeates the entire company. And I think that it's a very big deal here. You know, if you had Huey Lewis here right now, he'd tell you what makes you say, Huey, what really makes you proud? And he'd say that I haven't changed a team member from a roadie to my manager to any band member or what have you since the beginning. We've formed that team, we've held together, and we've gone at the world like this instead of like this, and it's been very effective. It's worked, and here we are.
Do you think that's a San Francisco trait?
I very definitely think that is. And you know, an interesting thing is when you go to Japan, they will tell you that they hear San Francisco, when they hear a tape or a record, they know without being told if it's a San Francisco group. That it's a moniker, it's a signature that is so easily and readily identified that it's just unbelievable. And if you question them, you say, oh, that's not true. Look at the disparity. You know, look at the uniqueness of something like Sly and the Family Stone or Santana, or, you know, they're all so different. How can that be? And there's some common denominator that is perhaps more obvious to those that are a little bit farther away from it. I might be a little too close, but I think that it's strong elements.
Look in the camera and say hi to John, and we'll call it quits.
Hey, John.
Thanks.
Okay, good. Yeah. That's great, huh?
Yeah.
The on tour, missing you. Didn't I show you that before?
No, man.
In fact, let me get my thing and I'll show it to you. They ran ads in the newspapers about it and everything.
Really?
Oh, it was a big promotion.
You're wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.